Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Kim Donovan and I am the Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative within the Geoeconomic Center. We are pleased to host today's event with Treasury Under Secretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Brian Nelson, to discuss key reforms to the United States anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism regulatory regime. Undersecretary Nelson was appointed by President Biden and confirmed in December 2021. Prior to serving in this role, the Undersecretary was the Chief Legal Officer for the Organizing Committee for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles, and he had a prestigious legal career serving in roles in the California Department of Justice and the United States Department of Justice's National Security Division. The Department of the Treasury has recently proposed reforms to the United States anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism regulatory regime to further secure our financial system from abuse by illicit actors and protect our national security interests. These reforms include regulations to beneficial ownership and FinCEN's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, to increase transparency in residential real estate, and an NPRM to apply comprehensive AML-CFT measures to certain investment advisors. We are meeting today following the Undersecretary's testimony to the House Financial Services Committee yesterday with FinCEN Director Andrea Gacki. Next week in Paris, over 37 jurisdictions, including the United States, will convene at the Financial Action Task Force to review global anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism recommendations and standards. Illicit finance and financial crime are at the top of policymakers and the financial sector's minds. These issues are at the core of the work we do in the Economic Statecraft Initiative, researching and analyzing how economic tools are used to advance foreign policy objectives, protect national security interests, and safeguard the global financial system. To quote Undersecretary Nelson, illicit finance is the common thread across our nation's biggest national security threats, from terrorism, drug trafficking, Russian aggression, and corruption. Illicit actors develop sophisticated mechanisms and exploit loopholes within our regulatory regimes to evade and circumvent sanctions, launder money, and conceal their involvement in illicit finance and financial crimes. This activity threatens the stability and integrity of the global financial system and harms millions of people who fall victim to financial crime. A recent report published by NASDAQ noted an estimated $3 trillion in illicit funds flowed through the global financial system just last year. Combating this activity is increasingly important for governments and financial institutions alike. Following Undersecretary Nelson's remarks, we will discuss the Treasury's efforts to address national security threats and regulatory reforms to protect the U.S. financial system from abuse by illicit actors. But first, Undersecretary Nelson, welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kim, and good morning. I'm Brian Nelson, Treasury's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. My office is responsible for leading U.S. government efforts to counter illicit finance and using financial tools to respond to national security threats. From terrorist financiers to cyber criminals and drug kingpins, our work centers on safeguarding the U.S. financial system from those who seek to corrupt it, exploit it, and use it to hide or launder illicit proceeds. Central to this mission is a recognition of the dangers that illicit finance threats pose not only to our national security and the integrity of the U.S. economy, but also to the economic opportunity afforded to hardworking, responsible Americans. The Treasury Department is reacting to the gravity of these challenges with a commitment to address the biggest vulnerabilities in the U.S. financial system through that corrupt actors, criminals, and other national security threats exploit to launder funds. We are undertaking a concerted effort to address the systemic deficiencies in the United States anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism framework, also known as AML-CFT. As I look forward to discussing with you this morning, over the past few days and weeks, we have announced several major initiatives that are designed not only to close critical regulatory loopholes and stay ahead of urgent national security threats, but also to increase transparency, fairness, and equity across the U.S. economy. As the world's largest economy and with the most globally integrated financial system, the steps that the United States takes to fight crime, corruption, and illicit finance will radiate outward, helping other countries to combat these challenges, and strengthening international AML/CFT standards. Treasury's efforts, therefore, will help us to advance prosperity and security at home while leading by example around the world. I am joining you all at a critical moment for U.S. national and economic security interests. It is a moment when the fentanyl crisis, fueled by transnational networks of complicit companies and criminal organizations, is exacting an enormous human toll in communities across the United States, taking an estimated 70,000 lives annually. According to the DEA, the two most sophisticated Mexican drug trafficking organizations, as well as their associates and facilitators, operate across all 50 U.S. states and in more than 50 countries. It is a moment when Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, tragically on the cusp of its 2-year mark, is making clear that increasingly sophisticated ways that Russian elites and businesses are seeking to violate U.S. sanctions in support of Vladimir Putin's war machine and at the expense of global security. At this moment, cyber criminals continue to plunder the life savings of hardworking Americans. We have ransomware actors continuing to wreak havoc on critical infrastructure, including against the Children's Hospital in Chicago just this month. Across the United States, fraudsters generate massive sums of illicit proceeds, often at the expense of taxpayer-funded programs and vulnerable populations. For example, frauds against the elderly, often referred to as elderly financial exploitation, are often linked to annual losses of more than $3 billion, with the average victim losing $35,000, and the associated proceeds often laundered through shell and front companies, wire transfers, and money mules. Over the past 4 months, we have seen in the Middle East the consequences of terrorist groups like Hamas and Iran-aligned militant groups continuing to access funds. Their actions have not only taken innocent lives, including the lives of Americans, but they've also threatened international commerce and stability. These threats, among others, share these important themes. They threaten U.S. national security and the lives of Americans. They undermine America's economic health, either by affecting Americans and businesses or by eroding trust in the integrity of our financial system. And they exploit vulnerabilities in the United States AML/CFT framework to launder, move, or store funds. This is why we are taking such substantial steps toward closing these loopholes in partnership with key stakeholders, including the private sector. The Treasury Department's efforts are rooted in our constantly evolving understanding of the illicit finance risks that the United States faces. Our assessments of who and what our biggest risks are, how these threat actors move or launder funds, and what regulatory loopholes and financial blind spots that they are exploiting to do so. To highlight these risks, last week Treasury published 3 national risk assessments for money laundering, terrorist financing, and the proliferation financing, from North Korea's efforts to exploit the U.S. financial system, to fund its nuclear program, to human traffickers, concealing their activities through front companies. These assessments shine light on the ways that these threat actors are seeking to operate under the radar. These studies aim not only to inform U.S. government efforts of the countless threats we face and safeguard the U.S. financial system, but also to help the private sector stay ahead of illicit activity and stay attuned to the biggest risks affecting their customers and their bottom lines. A recurring risk that we are focused on is the misuse of corporate structures to launder or conceal funds. Anonymous companies are a favorite tool for bad actors seeking to conceal their activities and their funds. Across our risk assessments, we have identified numerous cases involving criminals and U.S. adversaries seeking to exploit the anonymity using opaque corporate structures. To address these critical vulnerabilities of corporate anonymity, last month, Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise known as FinCEN, launched a beneficial ownership filing system pursuant to the Corporate Transparency Act. Under the new framework, many companies operating in the United States are now required to report information to FinCEN about their beneficial owners. In other words, the real people who own or control them. FinCEN stores this information in a secure, non-public database. With this information, we can better support law enforcement and other partners in untangling networks of shell companies run by criminals and work to hold them accountable. It is not only international malign actors like drug traffickers, Russian oligarchs, and Iranian agents exploiting shell companies, but also homegrown criminals like fraudsters, tax cheats, and corporate officials who use these tools to illicitly enrich themselves at the expense of their fellow Americans. For example, just last year, 7 individuals were indicted for an alleged conspiracy involving efforts to steal the identities of accountants and taxpayers, file a number of fake tax returns, and claim more than $100 million in refunds. Moreover, fraudsters have used shell companies to facilitate their exploitation of innocent American victims, and corrupt officials have hidden bribes and misappropriated funds through anonymous LLCs. Accordingly, FinCEN's efforts to promote corporate transparency will both keep our country's financial system safe and protect everyday Americans. Another major vulnerability involves the abuse of certain segments of the U.S. residential real estate sector. Although 80% of the residential real estate market has long been subject to stringent AML-CFT requirements, a range of national security threats, from foreign kleptocrats to drug kingpins, have been able to exploit certain regulatory gaps and anonymously park and launder their ill-gotten gains through all-cash purchases of U.S. real estate. They have leveraged the stability, the size, and the value of the U.S. housing market for their own nefarious gain, investing in an appreciating asset by hiding their wealth in Miami villas, Manhattan penthouses, and suburban neighborhoods. To address these regulatory gaps, just last week, FinCEN issued a proposal to increase transparency into certain non-finance transfers of U.S. residential real estate. This proposal builds on years of information collected through FinCEN's Residential Real Estate Geographic Targeting Orders program, which requires reporting on certain residential real estate transactions in specified geographic areas of the United States. Our proposed rule aims to equip our law enforcement and national security partners with a lasting tool to help curb the flow of illicit proceeds through the residential real estate market across all of America. Criminal exploitation of the real estate market does not just enable illicit activity, it can also be deeply unfair to everyday Americans. At a time when many American cities are grappling with limited housing supply and record high prices, criminals are able to buy homes anonymously. Many of the properties they purchase stay vacant for years, functioning not as homes, but as vehicles for storing and hiding ill-gotten wealth. Without action, this can exacerbate housing market manipulation and crowd out neighbors, towns, and cities. FinCEN's proposal aims to bring transparency to the sector and remedy the existing regulatory gaps that allow illicit actors to exploit the U.S. residential real estate market. Another one of our current priorities involves the misuse of the U.S. investment advisor sector by illicit actors. While many key players in the financial services sector, like banks, broker-dealers, and mutual funds, have for decades implemented regulations to identify and prevent money laundering and illicit financial activity, the investment advisor sector as a whole has not been consistently or comprehensively subject to these foundational AML-CFT obligations. As recent Treasury analysis has found, including in an illicit finance risk assessment for the investment advisor sector published just this week, illicit actors have moved massive amounts of funds through witting and unwitting investment advisors. In one instance, as part of the infamous 1MDB corruption scheme, investment funds laundered approximately $150 million to acquire interests in various companies owned or affiliated with an SEC-registered private equity firm. Separately, billions of dollars belonging to sanctioned Russian oligarchs and elites have been managed by U.S. investment advisors in violation of U.S. sanctions and in support of Russia's war in Ukraine. Additionally, foreign state actors have used surreptitious investments in private funds managed by U.S. investment advisors to again access sensitive and emerging U.S. technologies, undermining American innovation and economic competitiveness. To curb this illicit activity, earlier this week, Treasury issued a proposed rule to apply AML-CFT compliance program and suspicious activity report, otherwise known as SARS, filing obligations to certain investment advisors. These measures will be critical to helping prevent misuse of the sector and stopping illicit financial activity in the trade and protecting U.S. businesses from these threats. This proposal will allow us to harmonize regulatory obligations for advisors with existing obligations that already apply to banks, brokers, dealers, mutual funds, and others. It would also help to advance a level regulatory playing field across the financial services sector so that no firm gets an unfair advantage. As we work to address these systemic vulnerabilities in the U.S. financial system, getting feedback from our stakeholders, including the private sector, is essential. We're committed to ensuring that these initiatives both keep our country safe and advance fairness and opportunity. That is why, across all of our work, we will continue to make it a priority that regulatory obligations are clear, streamlined, and reasonable. We recognize that it is most often those in the private sector that are on the front lines of identifying illicit activity and helping us stop it. That is why we assign so much value to hearing from the private sector. As part of this rulemaking process, there is a public comment period, and we are looking forward to engaging with key stakeholder groups and making sure their voices are heard. The U.S. financial system is a pillar of the United States economic health and a driver of growth and opportunity across our nation. The same traits that make it such an asset to us, its size, its stability, its dynamism, and its centrality to the global commerce, to name just a few, also make it appealing to illicit actors. Addressing the gaps in our AML-CFT regime will help prevent bad actors from operating across the United States and protect Americans from harm. These efforts, assessing illicit finance risk, enhancing beneficial ownership transparency, and preventing the misuse of the residential real estate and investment advisor sectors, reflect our commitment to safeguarding the U.S. financial system. These efforts are not just priorities for the Treasury Department, they are also key goals for the President, who called on us to advance these initiatives when he published the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption in the first year of this administration. We will continue to take action to identify and mitigate vulnerabilities in other parts of our financial system as well. This work helps advance U.S. economic and national security while bolstering U.S. leadership and international standards relating to countering money laundering, terrorist financing, and illicit finance. We are committed to ensuring that the benefits of the U.S. financial system extend to all Americans through better jobs, equitable and fair markets, and economic prosperity, and while also protecting it from those who seek to exploit it. Thank you so much. Hi, Kim.
Hi. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll jump right into questions, if that's okay with you. So in your remarks, I mean, you went through some significant illicit financial
We're doing a lot.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit. I mean, are some of these, the risks that you outlined, are they new risks or things that Treasury's been focused on for a while?
Yeah, all of the risks that we've identified are not necessarily new, but our understanding of them have really evolved over time. That's why we, consistent with FATF standards, issue national risk assessments every 2 years. And the risk assessments that we issued just last week or 2 weeks ago expressed a lot of things that were expected, but some surprises as well. So in terms of money laundering risks, for a long time we've identified that fraud is one of the critical risks that we see bad actors seek to use our financial system to exploit. But we also have seen, and it's reflected really in the numbers of fentanyl-related deaths, how vulnerable our financial system is to drug trafficking organizations. We, of course, continually see the rise of cyber crime and cyber-enabled crime as a significant risk. And as we use these risk assessments to both express our concerns to our government partners, but also, again, to the private sector so they know what to look out for and really where to prioritize, like what are the most risky areas in terms of my personal vulnerabilities to bad actors and fraudsters, and of course to financial institutions and other key intermediaries. In the context of proliferation financing, one of the highlights of this year's National Risk Assessment, or lowlights, depending on how you look at it, is really the abuse of a lot of regional and large economies by Russia in order to procure critical components for their weapons programs. Weapons that are going directly, of course, onto the battlefield in their evasion, and unfortunately, almost 2 years into this war with Ukraine. So we had the opportunity to really highlight the typologies around that particular risk. And then with terrorist financing, of course, we're in this really horrendous moment with the attacks by Hamas in October of last year, and reflecting on terrorist typologies, even as we see that ISIS and Al-Qaeda continue to be significant threats to the homeland, but also the rise of domestic violence extremism and the concerns around that risk to Americans, and the continued concerns around potential so-called lone wolves, those who are inspired by extremist ideologies. So it's important that we're constantly updating our assessments of those risks and then communicating out to stakeholders and the public.
That's great. Yeah, the risk assessments really seem like a useful tool to be communicating with, especially the financial sector that has to be on the lookout for all these issues. You also discussed several new regulatory proposals and reforms.
Several.
And I've heard a hat trick be used a couple times. What are these reforms really trying to do? Like, are there loopholes that they're trying to close?
Absolutely. So, I think the reforms that we have announced, while having been, as I think many of the folks watching know, years in the making, and really reflect gaps that the president identified in the context of the first strategy to counter corruption that was released in the beginning of this administration. It really does reflect, I think, the amount of illicit activity we see associated with each of these areas. So beneficial ownership has long been identified as really sort of the critical gap in our financial institution. We have tens of millions of businesses for which we know very little about the ultimate beneficial owner behind those entities, which allows obviously for a number of anonymous companies, shell companies and the like to facilitate and really sort of serve as an on-ramp to illicit finance into our financial system. In the context of residential real estate, I think in some ways that one is going to be most obvious to Americans because everyone, I think, perceives the challenges in our housing market in terms of affordability, but also perceives that there are homes and properties that seem to be just sitting empty with no one in them for long periods of time, and obviously that corrodes neighborhoods and communities. And I think there we know that drug trafficking organizations and And again, like the kleptocrats like to really store and unfortunately enhance the value of their ill-gotten gains in the context of our residential real estate market. But that's a relatively small portion. We're only talking about 20%. So significant, obviously, significant enough to distort the overall market, but I think manageable in terms of this new AML CFT obligation imposed on those non-finance residential real estate transactions that don't involve an actual person, but involve a trust or some entity. And then lastly, our risk assessments really reflect the sort of abuse of our investment advisor sector, given that people can really shop around for those investment advisors that don't have AML, CFT obligations associated with their advice. So that allows these bad actors, the one MDB guy, I think, invested $1 billion in the US, having stolen billions and billions of dollars from one MDB. And we know and we have seen, and the good work of my colleagues exposed how a Russian oligarch really abused the trust entity to invest in our financial markets. And again, sort of the richness and the value and the opportunity to grow your funds, and then those funds obviously then fuel the corrupt activity in the context, obviously, of Russia in particular, the ability to support Putin and his onward prosecution of this war. So these efforts, years in the making, working with the Financial Action Task Force, we knew that these were big gaps, but also with our risk assessments, we have concluded that they are, in fact, the most significant gaps that we face in terms of dirty money coming into the US financial system.
It seems like the information that will potentially be collected as a result of these different regulatory reforms really help law enforcement address some of these issues, in addition to Treasury. You mentioned FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. I know that's coming up next week.
It is. It is.
And so I was wondering too, I'm not sure how much our audience really knows about that organization, but it is a standard-setting body for really the global on anti-money laundering. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, like, do these proposed reforms put us more in line with FATF standards and recommendations, or are we getting closer to alignment across the different jurisdictions?
It definitely does. I think in terms of how FATF works, it evaluates different jurisdictions on a regular timetable that I think is getting more and more compressed, as maybe it should. And the last time the U.S. was evaluated, it noted significant deficiencies in our beneficial ownership capacity, in our AML CFT obligations on our real estate sector, as well as in terms of AML CFT obligations in our financial services sector, particularly with respect to investment advisors. And it noted those deficiencies in the context of recognizing how bad money flows into jurisdictions. I think in the context for us of being a leader at the FATF. And really, I think from my perspective, as I've gone around the world to talk with other leaders about the work we can do together to better protect our respective financial institutions, how important it is for there to be AML, CFT obligations that everyone adheres to, agrees are sort of the right places to put our limited resources, and being in a better position to have those conversations and represent U.S. leadership in this space, I think puts everyone on a much better positions everyone much better, particularly in the context of this moment that we are all in, where the international rules-based order is frankly under threat. So expressing how important preserving that order is, and the value of doing that, and building collective consensus, even though this is just one leg of the proverbial stool. It's a really important one, and the more consensus we can build around each of these, I think, key concepts, the more successful we'll be in creating an international community that are really invested in upholding the overall rules-based order.
I think we'll end on that point.
Right.
It is such
Too short.
I know. Yeah, I know. Hopefully, you'll come back another time, and we can discuss further. Thank you again so much for joining us today. I do want to know for our audience that this event does mark a launch of a new line of effort in area of research for the Economic Statecraft Initiative. We've learned a lot about Russia over the past couple of years and how they're really abusing the financial system. So over the next couple of months, we are going to be digging deeper into that and covering some illicit finance issues. So please be on the lookout. But thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in.